Prestigious position of Chancellor. Thank you. Recording is in progress. I hope that's from Jeremy and not from someone in Beijing or Moscow. But if it is, well, what are you going to do? Yeah, I killed it. I'm getting pretty good at this computer thing. Before you know it, I'll be sending emails. I don't expect me to read any though, because I find them offensive. She holds the prestigious position of Chancellor at Durham University in the United Kingdom. Additionally, Dr. Hill is a Richard von Weizsäcker, I probably butchered that as my screen goes blank, fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin. Now, during her career, she's held a number of significant roles, including Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the United States National Security Council from 2017 to 2019, as well as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council from 2006 to 2009. I would like to bring to your attention as well that she is an accomplished scholar and author, having written, I think this is your most recent book, There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. And she was co-authored the book, Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin with Clifford Gaddy. Prior to joining Brookings, Dr. Hill was Director of Strategic Planning at the Eurasian Foundation in Washington, D.C. And from 1991 to 1999, she held a number of positions directing technical assistance and research projects. Yes, it's being live streamed now. Thank you. Directing technical assistance and research projects at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. And I could go on, but I'm taking her time. I think you understand the level and the caliber of what we're about to enjoy. Dr. Hill, thank you again for coming, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm absolutely delighted, in fact, to be here in Montgomery. Some people were saying how exciting, it is for me to be here. Actually, yes, I'm very excited to be here. This is my first time here in Montgomery, obviously a very famous and celebrated place, and I mean, it's just really been a great day also being at Maxwell Air Force Base. I'd also already done a few things online with Andy Eakin and some of his colleagues. There he is over there, but it's much better to be here in person, as we said. Zooming to Alabama isn't the same. Even though I'm actually Zooming now, it seems to quite a few other people and saying hi to Jeremy and others on the other side of the Zoom there. Now, I hope that I don't, in putting some notes down here on the computer, mess up everything. Mark's done a fantastic job of keeping this technologically above board. I'm with you on emails, by the way, I'm responding to emails, but I'm old school with very large font notes here, and I'll try not to mess anything up as we go along. But I wanted to just get us started with a quick or somewhat quick lay of the land about where we are with Ukraine and Russia at the moment. Obviously, something that's really preoccupying a lot of people, and especially over at Maxwell Air Base as well at the university there. And then I'd really like to have a discussion with everyone here. I'm sure you have a lot of questions, a lot of ideas yourselves, comments you might want to make. I'm also very much interested in getting your take on things too. There's a lot of expertise here. We've got professors from Troy University in Russian studies. Many people are from the region as well, or origins in the region. And I think, this could be a really good conversation. I'd like to leave as much time as possible. But look, we're almost 2 years into the war. Many people expected it to be over and done with, especially Vladimir Putin, in a matter of days. And it's not. And as these things tend to go, wars drag on, and that's, where we might well be headed. And a war that Vladimir Putin intended to be a special military operation, and many people thought would just be a regional conflict, has already transformed itself into a broader global conflict in terms of its ramifications and knock-on effects. People are very worried about the idea of World War III. I hate to say it, but we're already there in a structural context, because this is a war that's changing the system in which we operate. And it's changing the way that countries interact with each other. And so I'm going to talk about that a little more. As Mark mentioned, I had this title of the Richard von Weizsäcker. I've been practicing that, so don't worry about it. Fellowship at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin. Richard von Weizsäcker was a former president of Germany, and someone who in his youth had a very different trajectory. He was a member of the German cavalry who first moved into Poland in 1939. His twin brother was shot dead in that very first move of the German cavalry, still the cavalry on horseback, not the armored, kind of cavalry that we start to think about in World War II. He came from a Prussian aristocratic family, and after that he became a lifelong pacifist, very active in the Lutheran Church, and then went on to be president of Germany. And this particular fellowship was named after him. I had the great privilege of meeting him before he died a number of years ago. And his whole life was an example of how things get transformed by war and the way that people's views really change. Now, in places like Germany, where I was in Berlin for the last 6 months, it's very clear that this war and Russia's rupture with the West have had some really profound, very negative consequences. Germany has actually been uprooted by all of this. Its post-Cold War entire domestic and foreign policy was based on an idea of perpetual peace and prosperity and closer relationships with Russia. And of course, we've all heard of Ostpolitik, the political movement and whole ethos and guiding principle that Germany really engaged in from the 1960s onwards under the Chancellor Willy Brandt. Well, that's all completely upended. The whole idea that Germany would have a closer relationship with the East, with Russia, is out the window. There's a great deal of anger. Germany has really kind of transformed its whole relationship with Russia. You might still be hearing a lot about sympathy towards Russia, yes, in certain quarters, but the whole of the German political class is filled with anger and also shame that they kind of completely and utterly, as George Bush would have said, underestimated their relationship with Russia. So we're seeing massive shifts there. And there's also a feeling, throughout Europe that the war has really created a big drag on countries' ability to adapt to all of the other changes that we're already going through. The climate changes and the mounting crisis, other global challenges, the demographic shifts, and the new digital and technological revolution. Germany in particular feels that it's become unmoored and doesn't really know where it's heading at this moment. So we're going to have to, watch this space, but I could also say that about other European countries. And then there's a great deal of concern in Europe about the costs, not just of the war. I mean, we're debating that, here right now, but also the prospects for Ukraine's post-war reconstruction. Because Germany and other European countries, the UK, where I'm originally from, are all experiencing now something of an economic downturn. They're struggling with many of the same issues that we are domestically. They're worried about their own, future, the future of their economy. And the big debates that are going on there about sanctions, just like we're having here, Russian blockades of the Black Sea, for example, and the wanton destruction of all of Ukrainian infrastructure. The big question in Europe, on top of all of the refugee flows, I mean, most of Europe is basically taking in large numbers of refugees. All of the neighboring countries have. There are 1.5 million refugees from Ukraine now in Germany, as well as refugees from Russia who are fleeing, being conscripted into the war. Huge numbers, of course, in Poland and other countries. This is already having a lot of knock-on effects. And so on top of the pandemic, and all of the other longer lingering effects of the 10 years ago, the great financial crisis, in Europe, there's a big question about where does this go, even in peacetime, once the war is ended. So I would just sort of say we've got a long way before this plays itself out. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Ukraine, having kind of set the scene there that there's going to be a lot of knock-on effects in Europe, as well as the debates that are going on here about Ukraine and the war. But Ukraine's future itself is also dependent on a broader global perspective, not just on the economic, political, and security resilience of Europe, or assistance, from the United States and what's happening on the battlefield. Ukraine will never be able to turn the clock on this war. Now, let's just state this, out front. And in fact, President Zelensky, in a recent interview, he was asked about, winning the war. And of course, he also said, how is Ukraine really going to win given the destruction and all the people that have died? This is a war for Ukraine's survival. It's a war for its independence and territorial integrity, obviously, but there's no winning when you've seen so much destruction. This is not going to be any more the Ukraine after independence in 1991. That Ukraine is gone. It won't be the Ukraine of 2021, just before Russia launched the invasion. That's also gone. In the next 30 years, irrespective of how the war ends, you're going to see major changes. Not just the population shifts we've already seen. A lot of the refugees, they're mostly women and children, will not go back to Ukraine. In fact, the Germans were talking about how they hoped that the Ukrainians would stay because they've got major labor shortages. And it's a big difference of having lots of women and children coming from Ukraine and single young men coming from Syria and Afghanistan. Let's be frank, all the debates about migration in Europe, Ukrainians have been welcomed because they're, just as many refugees are welcomed after World War II, that they're seen as part of the European space. And there's actually then quite a lot of effort to try to enable them to stay in Poland and elsewhere as well. So we may see that Ukrainians don't go back, even if they might intend to go back as at the end of the war. There's all the economic desiccation, the destruction of infrastructure I mentioned, and then there'll be further demographic decline because of so many men being killed on the front. It's exactly what you saw in Europe after World War I. And again, after World War II, massive population decline. So Ukraine was one of the biggest countries in Europe. It still is in terms of landmass, obviously after Russia. But in terms of its population of 40 million Ukrainians, over the next 30, 40 years, we might more see like 20 million Ukrainians if we really start to play out the demographics. So this is devastating. This is an absolute tragedy, no matter, again, how this war ends. And then, as I mentioned, there's this kind of inevitable question about who pays for reconstruction. There may be a backlash across the European Union with Ukraine being brought in. So Ukraine is going to probably be facing, a lot of complexity and a lot of political upheaval in the time ahead. I was really struck in Germany, by how heavily Germany has invested in many of its own economic transitions. The Germans are worried now with pulling away from Russian gas, cheaper Russian gas, what happens to their big manufacturing industry. They worried with the advent of the electrical vehicles, battery operated electrical vehicles, about the combustion engine, obviously, and then the future of the car industry. So they have been actually investing very heavily in the billions of dollars, just like we've had, recently in the United States, infrastructure and manufacturing, in trying to tackle the future transition. They're moving away from coal. They have allotted 40 billion euros for the transition of 80,000 coal miners in the Lausitz in East Germany and also in the Rhineland. They've already transitioned away from coal in the Ruhr region, and they've already allotted all of that money. So the big debate in Germany was, well, where's the money going to come from to reconstruct Ukraine? And everyone's already acknowledging it's certainly not going to come from the United States. There's not going to be a Marshall Plan, like we basically initiated in Europe after World War II. That's just not where we are. Europeans know that they're going to have to step up and step in, bring Ukraine in, but there's a lot of concern about where's the money going to come from and what's that going to do then, politically. So peace will also present challenges, not just war. This is what I mean about these longer and bigger ramifications and challenges as a result of this really devastating war. I want to also talk a little bit about Ukraine's security. I'm sure a lot of this will come up in discussion and in some of the things that you may be thinking about. But Ukraine has a particular location, which adds to complexity about its security. We're all thinking about the long term, about Ukraine's security and security guarantees. But look, Ukraine is a multi-regional state. It borders a lot of countries, not just Russia and Belarus. It has relationships, obviously, here with the United States. We have a lot of Ukrainian Americans and a long-standing relationship over the last 30 years. It's got this new relationships with the European Union. It may become a member of both the European Union and NATO in the next few years. It's got neighbors in Central and Eastern Europe that it's got a long history and complex history with, including Poland and then the Baltic states and Lithuania. Ukraine was once part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was at one point the biggest state in Europe. One of those fun facts, if you kind of, go back to the 15th and 16th century. At various points, it's been partitioned among and between many different countries. So it's got linkages with the Baltic states, the Scandinavians. At one point, it was part of the Swedish Empire. Again, complicated history. It's a Black Sea country, but we've got a colleague here from Bulgaria. Ukraine has all of these long and historic ties with Bulgaria and Romania, and the Black Sea region with Greece across the Black Sea and Turkey. It's very interesting to note that the new Defense Ministry of Ukraine, Rustem Umerov, is a Crimean Tatar. And I think that what Ukraine's trying to do with that is signal very strongly its deep roots in the Black Sea, the fact that Crimea was not initially a Slavic peninsula. It hasn't been Russia since time immemorial. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. It was originally settled by Tatars. The largest group of Crimean Tatars outside of Ukraine, I mean, they were deported by Stalin to Central Asia, are in Turkey. And there are some pretty prominent Turkish politicians of Crimean Tatar. And I think that, this is Zelensky and Ukraine's effort to try to pull, the Turks away from their ever closer relationship, it seems, with Putin, and also to signal to the rest of the Black Sea, to Bulgaria, where there also were Tatar and other populations, that, basically they should be paying close attention to what's happening. There were also very large Greek populations in and around Crimea, and in the Sea of Azov, Mariupol, the city that was completely obliterated during the course of this conflict, used to be a Greek colony. And I'm not talking about ancient Greek, I'm also talking in more recent times as well. So Ukraine has a deep history in all of these different regions, and also has to think about itself in multiple different contexts. The G7, the G20 relationships. But one of the issues that is actually proving most problematic for Ukraine at the moment is as the United States. And I want to talk about that a little bit more. That might sound counterintuitive, especially as US military support is so vital for what's happening on the battleground. But outside of Europe in the transatlantic arena, we, the United States and also NATO, have an image problem, which Vladimir Putin, as I'm sure all of us are aware, is very cleverly exploiting to Ukraine's distinct disadvantage. So as we are a great asset to Ukraine, we, the United States, we're also something of a liability. And I just want to talk about this for a little while. Because over the last several years, we've really kind of seen that our moral standing has really dropped globally in the United States. I was talking to someone here about this a little bit earlier. Sadly, a lot of this goes back to Iraq in 2003 and the US invasion of Iraq. That was not well received elsewhere in the world. And there's been a lot of challenges, obviously, as we well know, to American leadership of global institutions, not just from Russia, but also from China. And Putin has really been able to play on this extremely effectively in the lead up to the war, but certainly since he invaded Ukraine. Putin has always presented NATO as a great threat, and there's certainly a lot of Americans who also seem to believe that NATO provoked this war. For Putin, he's never really seriously sought an accommodation with NATO as Gorbachev and Yeltsin did. He sees NATO as the Cold War adversary that hasn't really changed, and he wants to see NATO gone. And outside of Europe, as I mentioned before, obviously China is a major let's just say competitor, I'll put it neutrally for now, and then we can talk about China later, to the United States. But there are also a lot of other countries who, traditionally have been unaligned. Brazil, for example, South Africa, India. India obviously sees the United States also as a partner and asset, but also has some trepidation. A lot of these countries would also like to have more say in their own regions. And so a lot of what we would call middle powers or swing states globally would also like to see the United States somewhat diminished in their own neighborhood as the dominant player. And Putin has encouraged all of this, basically, whispering in people's ears, not just whispering people's ears, trying to encourage regional elites, to pull away from the United States. And here, when we look back over the last decades, we've got to a point where there are many players globally who would like to see a world without a hegemon. We see a lot of resistance globally to the US framing of a great power competition with China, a lot of countries that don't want to be part of a US or a Chinese bloc. And I'm basing a lot of this commentary on a series of dialogues that we've been doing at Brookings over the last several years with think tank representatives and former government officials from a whole host of different countries. And we've been really struck all the time by particularly the way in which they look at the war in Ukraine through a prism of how they feel about the United States. It's not that countries are particularly fond of Russia or that leaders particularly love Vladimir Putin, although a few of them do, but just a very small handful. It's really that they don't like us. And they don't like us for a variety of reasons. And they also don't just like us, the United States, but they also don't like, and I'm saying now, us of the United Kingdom or the West, countries in what we used to call Francophone Africa, hate being called by countries in Francophone Africa. They don't like the French. They don't like the French in Lebanon. They don't like the French in Mali. They don't like the French in Niger or Benin and Togo. That's the old colonial overlord. They don't like the UK and many places in Africa and, elsewhere as well. And there's just a sort of a bubbling resentment that keeps coming out of all of our interactions with our counterparts in Brazil and South Africa and India and elsewhere about the West, and that they see this war in Ukraine as a turning point. This gets back to what I was saying about a global system changing war. They actually would like to see a different international system come out of this. Look, in many respects, this isn't a 21st century war in Ukraine. It's a continuation of the wars that we've had already in the 20th century, World War I and World War II. Putin talks about it in that context. It's not just about talking about World War II and Nazis in Ukraine. He also talks about how Ukraine shouldn't exist, that it's only because Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks created Ukraine after the Russian Revolution as a Soviet republic that Ukraine exists. He's dragging us all the way back all the time to the 20th century. And even though the Soviet Union collapsed, for Putin, he always still thinks in that terms, as we're well aware. But other countries as well feel that they're kind of also stuck in a back to the future, Groundhog Day kind of European conflict. They can't get rid of it either, and we're trying to drag them back in. The rest of the world is pretty fatigued with this as well. And we've heard, quite frequently from some of our Indian counterparts in the particular, they're like, they're always saying to us, you Europeans again, or you, the United States, our problems, you don't pay attention to them, but your problems, we have to pay attention to them all the time. Why is Ukraine our problem? So we have a really hard time getting across why they should care about the war in Ukraine and why they should, really care about what Putin is trying to do here. So this is really, in many respects, the problem that we're dealing with in the course of this war in Ukraine. There's constant references in all the interactions that we have with our counterparts in other places to the US invasion of Iraq. Unfortunately, because we're here on September the 12th, the day after the commemorations of the horrible attacks of September 11th, I would actually say that unfortunately Osama bin Laden has succeeded in many respects in kind of provoking the kind of reaction that he wanted to get out of the United States that would really erode the United States standing. Because time and time again, we also hear from counterparts in the Middle East, well, what about what you did in the, the war on terrorism? What about what you did in Iraq? What about what you did in Afghanistan? Why again should we be paying attention to what's happening in Ukraine? Russia's only doing what the United States has done. You overreacted, and now you're expecting us to react to, something that's linked to problems that you have. Now, again, I just want to say, and I just want to repeat that despite these comments, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is actually viewed pretty negatively elsewhere in the rest of the world. None of this means that it's viewed positively. And there's a number of things to pay attention to here. We've had multiple votes against Russia in the United Nations General Assembly. We've got the International Court of Justice ruling against Russia, the International Criminal Court, and other international institutions have all emphasized that what Russia's done is illegal. There's no moral high ground for Russia in the war. Russia's brutal conduct, all the atrocities, its blunders and failures have all diminished its standing. And it's been interesting when I've been, and my other colleagues have been talking to these interlocutors who said these pretty negative things about us. I can't say this has been a very pleasant set of conversations that we've been having here. They have been very clear that they see Russia as something of the past now. as its international standing really dropping. They see China as rising, and Russia is kind of starting to fade into the distance, despite the fact of the war, and it's still being center stage. But they still use us as the prism for looking at Russia's actions. And again, sometimes when China and India and other countries abstain in the UN, it's because they're signaling displeasure with something we've done, rather than signaling any kind of affinity with Russia. I'm trying to think about some of the other points that I would like to make, and then I'd really like to turn it over to you. I think you get the point here that we've got quite a bit of a problem with the way that the war is being seen in Ukraine. The false narratives that Russia has had about the United States or about NATO have really started to take hold because they comport with the negative views and the image problem that we have in other places, or facts as they see them. We've had, further issues of pushback when we talk to, again, some of our interlocutors in Brazil and elsewhere. They don't like the fact that we use sanctions. They worry that they'll get sanctioned. They're always hoping for some kind of alternative to the dollar. The energy blockades, Russia's Black Sea blockade on Ukrainian grain, that all tends to get blamed on us. And there's a real push all the time here that if we find a resolution to war in Ukraine, will we create a new international system? So this is kind of where we are now as we start to think about how do we get out of this terrible war and what do we do in the future? That if other countries are basically saying, if we support you and if we step up on diplomacy, what are you going to do for us? And how is the international system going to be different? Will the United Nations look different? Will the United States be trying to push and frame everything in its own context? We don't want to be part of a clash between the United States and China. So how are things going to look forward? Now, there are a couple of points that I wanted to conclude with, despite all of the difficulties, obviously, that this kind of attitude seems to raise, is that there are some glimmers of hope and optimism here. They're not huge, bright lights, they are glimmers, but I think that we do have some scope for diplomacy alongside whatever's happening in the battlefield. And I don't want to leave you with any impression that I'm thinking that we should step back from support of Ukraine on the battlefield. I think that we absolutely have to continue to stand by Ukraine here because the stakes are very high, and I can talk about that, more as we go on to the discussion. But I do think that we need to step up the diplomacy alongside, in part because of such a negative reactions on our own image problem and the image problem that we have for NATO. But we need to do that with some of our allies and partners. Obviously, the UK has got some of its own liability problems, even though the UK is all in on supporting Ukraine in the war. France and Germany also have, although I think that the Germans have still something of the moral high ground, given all of the efforts that they've undertaken since World War II to transform themselves. A lot of countries do admire, what Germany has done here. But we really need to think in real depth about how we craft a diplomacy to get Ukraine more global support so that we are not seen as some kind of liability for Ukraine's position. I think you can see Zelensky taking this on board. They've had meetings in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia, not just in Copenhagen. They've been reaching out to the African Union. Zelensky has become, a world traveler, not just on Zoom, but also showing up in person to talk to people directly. Ukraine is being its own advocate about why countries should care about Ukraine and support Ukraine. But I think we also have to kind of try to figure out what alternative state actors do we have who could help us gain traction for Ukraine that we could use to help push forward international diplomacy to try to restore peace through collective action, not just on the battlefield. Kenya has been quite outstanding at the United Nations. I'd commend you to listen to the speech of the Kenyan permanent representative at the UN during one of the resolutions there. Singapore and Asia have also been trying. We have the Scandinavian countries that never had any colonies anywhere in Africa or anywhere else, even though Sweden was an imperial country in parts of Europe. At one point, the north of England was also under the Danish Empire. We've forgiven them, but, sometimes, you get a bit upset about those Vikings. The Baltic states, haven't really, been out there. The Finns, I think we've got to really start being creative about thinking about who can advocate on our behalf as well as on Ukraine's behalf. many of the countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America still see the United Nations as a credible and important actor, even if we don't always. And the General Assembly, has taken a strong stance. The Secretary General Gutierrez has done an awful lot to try to tackle the Black Sea grain blockade by Russia. We've had the International Atomic Energy Agency really step up on the Zaporizhia nuclear plant. There are different mechanisms that we could use in the United Nations, perhaps to craft a larger diplomatic effort. There are people who would like to see the International Court of Justice do a ruling on Ukraine's behalf about the validity of its pushback against Russia, for example. So I think at this stage, we have to really start thinking creatively about how we can work with what we've got to try to make diplomacy a more powerful part of our toolbox, not just what's happening on the battleground. And, I'm sure we're going to be talking about this as we go on tonight, but we also have to, think about ourselves, about our own history here in the United States. It took the United States a very long time to establish its independence. Russia and Putin are always saying, well, Crimea and Ukraine belong to us because we took it in 1783. And I talked about this a little bit earlier today. Ukraine annexed the Crimean Peninsula Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula in April of 1783 from the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't until September 1783 that we had the Treaty of Paris, which recognized the United States as a fully fledged country. Florida still wasn't in the United States then, for all those of you who are from Florida. Canada was British North America, it wasn't Canada. And there were huge numbers of what we think of as traditional US territories now that weren't part of the United States. So, if we're kind of going back to 1783, but April 1783, we weren't really there either, on the map. So I don't see why we should be giving, Vladimir Putin and Russia, the benefit of 1783 as being kind of the starting point of history. So, that's just sort of something to keep in mind as we start to think about claims on territory. Europe has torn itself apart twice in the 20th century based on various historical claims, and it shouldn't be doing it again. And I just actually wanted to say, because I see our colleague from Bulgaria, Bulgaria is the only European country that actually has a long, more than a millennia existence. Bulgaria has been on the maps of Europe since the 7th century, although not in its complete borders, but it is the oldest European country in terms of its name. It's not Russia. Anyway, thanks a lot. My voice is going here. But I would love to move over to Q&A and discussion, Mark. Thank you.
Okay, well, if you've been with us before, while we've tried these remote sessions as well, what we'll do is I'll offer the microphone to someone with a question here in the room. Then we'll toss to Jeremy in our audience out in Zoom land and back and forth to keep it balanced. So with that, again, thank you for those comments. I think if nothing else, one of the things, if I may, we struggle with our military officers is getting them to think outside themselves. And you've made some very important points about that may strike many Americans as odd, that the world may be viewing this war in Ukraine, not necessarily on its own merits, but through their view of us. And we have struck ourselves since 1945 in our own engagements, because we oftentimes can't get out of our own way and can't think beyond ourselves. So I personally am going to emphasize that point when we get back to Air University. So with that, who would like to open the floor with the first question? Okay, excuse me.
From your experience and your knowledge, what do you think will drive Putin to a diplomatic solution? Because right now there doesn't seem to be any incentive. He doesn't care about his troops, his military. He's isolated. What do you think will be the thing that brings him around?
Well, look, it's very difficult to imagine any one single thing that would bring him around. His sudden death might be one factor that we obviously should be contemplate or probably do it. He's really the wild card in the system at the moment, and I'm sure plenty of people have on their minds, is Vladimir Putin, going to die anytime soon? And sometimes I want to, add a kind of caution there that I came to the conclusion from a lot of the work that I was doing that I think that Putin himself encourages some of this kind of discussion because, it tends to get people to, lower their guard. If you kind of think he might be out of the picture, then you're not thinking through all the kind of consequences of things that he might be doing. You're constantly just sort of thinking all the ways in which he might be dying. This was certainly a trick that Islam Karimov, the former president of Uzbekistan, used to do. He would definitely be sowing some of the kind of seeds of his imminent demise to see who wanted to stand up and to get into his position. And at one point, it turned out to be one of his own daughters, and she ended up in house arrest and worse for a long period afterwards. So, that's just, on that score, we should be very, careful of thinking that would be one way of ultimately changing his mind. Look, I think that apart from, some dramatic disaster for him on the battlefield, which again, sitting and standing here in this, kind of environment, we could play through some of those scenarios, but, it's hard to really kind of imagine how they would take place. If you think back to World War I and World War II, there was a long, horrible grind. And things are often, just like we're always obsessing about, Ukraine's current offensive, things that were meant to be the decisive battle in World War I and World War II weren't. And sometimes, some of the battles that people didn't anticipate, we can go back that through history as being decisive, certainly turned out to have been. Was Waterloo going to be the decisive battle against Napoleon? It turned out to have been, but it might not have been. I always remember as a British school child, we all thought about it was, Lord Wellington, Duke of Wellington, who had managed to call in the day. But when you go to Germany, they're always talking about Field Marshal Blücher, who appeared from, nowhere with his helmet is unturned, the tide. Everybody's got a different viewpoint of, what was decisive at different points. And it's hard to say that any one thing at this particular point might be decisive, but there could be, major disasters. There's many different points. When you look back to World War I, the Tsar totally mismanaged the battlefront. And then he turned it around. It was when he was turning it around that the revolution took place, because the soldiers felt so ground down on the battlefield that even though they started to have successes, many of them just decided, that's it, I'm done. And in World War I, what really did the Russians and the Tsar in was their soldiers deciding to flee the battlefield. So, what at the very beginning, I was wondering, as many other people were, when 1 million plus Russians left Russia, would that be it? Would people who were fleeing conscription continue to do so? But Putin seems to have weathered that. It's not just that they were recruiting people from prisons, but people stopped fleeing. People started to actually go, okay, I'm gonna go into the army. But then there was the Prigozhin push. And then it looked again. Everyone's watching, for 2 days, thinking, what's going to happen here? Is this going to be is this a real coup? Is this just an insurgency? What's going to happen? Will this be a turning point? Well, what Prigozhin is saying about the war, because he was speaking pretty bluntly, this was a disaster, this was a mistake. The people who were running the war don't know how to win it. It was a kind of a weird, critique of the war. It was a disaster, but we still want to win it. We've got to turn it around. I want the generals, who can really win here, to be put in place, again, sounding a lot like World War I. Putin starts to talk about 1917 and World War I, which isn't, a great victorious moment, for Russia. It's almost as if he's tempting it to happen. And then it's over, before you could blink. And then Prigozhin falls out of the biggest window in the sky. And 2 months later, and he's gone. And then everyone's like, well, Putin's, back in there and more in power, than he was before. So hard to say that one single thing will change the tide of this, but there could be this accumulation, the kind of a slicing kind of away at Russian resolve, a grinding away at Russia's military capacity. We're all watching that very closely. But this is why I think that the diplomatic effort is, so decisive as well. It's not just if, kind of other European countries speak out very forcefully. Putin's waiting for politics to turn in countries. He believes here in 2024 will be dispositive. He's looking at Slovakia right now. There's a kind of election that may bring in a pro-Russian, pro-Putin president. Putin is convinced that we will lose our resolve, which is why I said before that we have to show something different. The more that we wobble and talk about, remember Michael Thatcher said it to Ronald Reagan, don't go wobbly on me, Ronnie, when it was all about, the kind of the Cold War and the standoff with Gorbachev. The same holds. We don't have Margaret Thatcher anymore. We have Rishi Sunak. Probably doesn't quite sound quite the same, you know, what they all mean. But anyway, if we just kind of channel that feeling there, we've got to show that we have resolve and that we are able to, you know, basically stay the course diplomatically and all the other issues as well. And it's not that the fickleness of our politics will change the tide here. We've also got to work with the Indians. We've got to work with the Chinese. It's harder, of course, but we've got to work with as many countries as we possibly can, the Brazilians and others who are, you know, basically the naysayers on support for Ukraine, to show that it's actually in their interests to put Ukraine's interests higher on the agenda. And I think the Ukrainians are getting through, that their fate would be, you know, a pretty dramatic negative outcome for other countries as well. And I mean, just, you know, to figure out, you know, how you explain this to other countries, which, you know, we have been trying in these dialogues that we've been having with colleagues as well. Look, Ukraine, again, I've made the analogy with the United States. The United States is a country that wrested its independence away from Britain. It took a long time, you know, to basically establish that independence, and it was recognized. The Russians recognize Ukraine's independence, and Kazakhstan's, and Belarus's, and Moldova's, and Armenia's, and Azerbaijan's. For 30 years, they never made a claim against Ukraine, not once. I mean, there might have been people claiming the territory, and we saw that they annexed it, but they never made a formal claim. We have conflicts around the world, including between Greece and Turkey, China, and it's not just Taiwan, but China and India and Pakistan, we could go on, where there are claims against other countries' territory. If Putin gets away with this, well, good luck with then, you know, kind of basically pushing back and rebuffing your neighbor's predation on your territory, because Putin has shown that if you have force, that then you can easily predate on your neighbor, you can get away with this. The other thing is his nuclear power. We pushed Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan to give up their nuclear weapons. And we, the United States and the United Kingdom, so both of my wings, gave assurances to Ukraine that nothing would happen to them. Well, something really big has happened to them. And Ukrainians, you know, at the time back in 1993, didn't really want to give up their nuclear weapons without assurances and guarantees. Same with Kazakhstan and Belarus. Belarus has already been absorbed by Russia. We never talk about Belarus, it's just vanished in plain sight. But, you know, then you've got Kazakhstan. The Kazakhs are pretty nervous because the northern part of Kazakhstan was settled by Slavs. It's the old virgin lands from the Khrushchev period with the extension of, you know, the kind of agriculture and wheat and grain growing there. And, you know, Kazakhstan is just as artificial a country as every other country is. I mean, most countries are artificial. We've all had changing borders, the United States being a case in point. So the Kazakhs are, well, we're definitely next. Or the Moldovans know that they're next because they were the region of Bessarabia, and Lukashenko in Belarus told them they were next. The Poles have wondered, why are we next? How many times have we partitioned? 3 times, you know, by all the other European countries. The Finns have joined NATO because they thought, well, we're definitely going to be next then. Because, you know, the Russians, we were part of their empire for longer than most parts of Ukraine were. The Baltic states the same. Stalin tried to take Finland back in 1939. They did take the Baltic states back. You know, where does this end? So that's the kind of message that we have to get across. And if we're just going to then say, well, not our problem, you know, what about our own history? France continued to support the United States in its independence against Britain. What if it hadn't in 1815? And the British hadn't just, you know, tried to burn down the White House, but had tried to take, you know, the United States back again. We've got to, you know, kind of think about the precedent that this might be setting.
Jeremy, I'm assuming you can hear us. We can't see you, at least. Oh, there you are. Minimized. We're used to seeing him on the big screen. Over to you if you have a question from the audience that's out there remote.
Yes, thank you. I'll go back to Therese Hogan from Paris, the one in France, not the one in Texas, who challenges your use of the equivalence thesis. The Middle East analogy doesn't seem apt, she writes. The US did not go into Iraq and Afghanistan, however unwisely, in order to seize those countries' land, in contrast to Russia in 2022.
Well, I would agree with Therese. Absolutely spot on, but that's unfortunately not what other people think. So when I was talking about these analogies, I was relaying, just to be very clear, what we're hearing from others. So again, just to clarify, for the last year and a half, colleagues at Brookings have been engaging in a series of dialogues with counterparts in other countries. Some of the BRICS countries, Brazil and India, South Africa, and a host of others, to try to get that feedback from them. And we've also been engaging with representatives from embassies in Washington, D.C. and others in other conferences and international gatherings to get feedback from them about how they are seeing the war. And unfortunately, that's how they see it. They see an equivalency between what the United States does and what Russia has done. And look, I'll say that some of our European allies think the same thing. You remember that there were 1 million people protesting on the streets of London, even as the Blair government was supportive of the Bush decision to go into Iraq. But that's not what 1 million plus people in the United Kingdom are thinking of. And when you talk to the Russians, and I've interviewed Russians about this, for many time, their views of the United States really dramatically changed after the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Now, yes, it was obvious that the United States was not going into annexed territory in either Iraq or Afghanistan, but we stayed in both countries for a very long time. And we were also then engaged in the process of nation building. And that really changed the views because it looked like an occupation. As far as the Russians are concerned, it looked very much like what they'd done in Afghanistan. And in fact, they were there for 10 years, we were there for 20. So when you talk to the Russians, they're saying, what's the difference? Now we can talk about the differences, but they're seeing them as finer points. So, I mean, again, to clarify to Therese, that's not what I'm saying, that these are the comparisons. I'm saying that this is what we hear from other interlocutors elsewhere in the world, which means that we have a problem in terms of explaining ourselves. So what about us and what about what the United States has done starts to be the framework for people thinking about Ukraine. And this is very difficult. It's very uncomfortable. I was very uncomfortable hearing, some of this. There's also, for the Ukrainians, I was at a big conference in Tallinn in May of this year, and I gave a speech along these lines. It was in honor of the first independent president of Estonia, that being, after the Cold War, Lennart Meri. About, basically the war in Ukraine becoming a kind of proxy war of the rest of the world against the United States. And there was a lot of Ukrainian representatives there, and there was a panel in which there were representatives of from Kenya, Oman, also the place in the Middle East. I mean, again, this is some of the places where we're hearing some of this commentary from. And the Ukrainian representatives in the hallway during the Q&A said, look, why can't you see that we were colonies of Russia? And basically the response from the Middle East and the African representatives there was like, European countries can't be colonized. Europeans are colonizers. And I was like, well, ask the Irish and people around here, I mean, I'm partly Irish, okay, or the Welsh, 800 years of colonization by England. Scotland was a colonizer. I mean, the reason I'm 50% Scottish, I can say this, the reason that Scotland joined with England in the United Kingdom in 1707 was because of a failed colony in the Darien Gap in Panama. We read about the Darien Gap where all the migrants are trying to go through. Well, the Scots, you've seen the pictures of this horrible, muddy jungles, impenetrable. The Scots tried to colonize this. They were thinking ahead towards the Panama Canal. They realized that there would be the savvy on the engineering side, not so savvy about the placement of a colony. They lost 40% of Scotland's national wealth in a misplaced effort of colonizing, and they needed bailing out by English financiers because they'd blown the Scottish banks. And the English financial would-be, kind of lenders to bail the Scots out said, well, we want parliamentary oversight. So you're going to have to, join in with the parliaments. You had the Union of Parliaments in 1707 because of the failed colony. But the Welsh and the Irish had nothing to do with any of this, just like the Ukrainians didn't and the Finns, but they couldn't get that message across. So it's kind of a part of a problem that if you're sitting in other parts of the world, things look very different from what they look like here. And, I wish we'd been having these kinds of dialogues a lot earlier because it would have helped to explain, I think, a lot of the reactions that have seemed mystifying, up until now.
Thank you. Next question, right here in the front, and I will get you guys in the back Next go.
What is your take on the dialogue that Putin's going to be having or is having with North Korea and China?
Yeah, I don't think we'd ever thought we'd have seen the day when Russia and Vladimir Putin were looking to Kim Jong-un and North Korea for military support. You know, this is a real system changing war, as we can see here. I mean, in many respects, this is an act of sheer desperation. You know, we do think that, you know, people are always saying rather that they think that the sanctions are not working and you know, Putin isn't isolated, because he doesn't really appear to be all that isolated a lot of the time, because he still has, you know, friends in all kinds of places, but his friends are increasingly North Korea, Iran. You know, with China, he does have a genuine friendship, it seems, with President Xi, but there's still a lot of kind of skepticism about Russia and China itself, just like there's a lot of trepidation in Russia about China. But with Kim Jong-un, you know, Putin is actually, you know, trying to basically get spare equipment. And there's a real lesson in all of this. Russia was a major arms exporter to, you know, all different parts of the world. And Russia has used up so much ammunition and equipment that it's no longer sending spare parts to countries. I talked to a representative from Rwanda a couple of weeks ago, and they said they're looking for spare parts because they bought all of their equipment from Russia. And I said, well, be careful. Russia might want the spare parts from you, you know, rather than, you know, sending them to, because that's what's happening with North Korea. You know, they're looking around for the Soviet era weaponry. They're looking for drones, you know, they're looking for all kinds of, you know, we've seen with Iran providing drones. This is a real flip from, you know, the Russia and the Russian military that we thought it was before. So on that score, you know, there's quite a few salutary lessons, I think, you know, for Russia and Putin. The other thing, of course, is that I would say that Putin and Russia have gone somewhat rogue, particularly when you look at it in the nuclear field. And, you know, there are some pretty disturbing elements of basically watching Putin and Kim Jong-un coming together, because Kim Jong-un has become the master of nuclear blackmail. And, you know, every time we see them launching a rocket, even if it just crashes into the Sea of Japan, it's meant to have an exploitative element. And Putin's gone on full on Kim Jong-un on nuclear issues, very different from what we'd have expected from the Soviet Union or the Russia of the past. That was very concerned about non-proliferation, concerned about strategic stability and parity, you know, with the United States. Now Putin wants to do the same thing that Kim Jong-un is doing, which is exploit his nuclear weapons for blackmail purposes. If you don't give me Ukraine, I'm going to blow up a nuclear weapon. You know, if Ukraine doesn't give away this bit of a territory, I'm going to blow up a nuclear weapon. And there has been a pushback against Putin and Russia for doing this by the Indians, by the Chinese, because, you know, if Putin gets away with doing this, it's very different from Kim Jong-un firing off a missile, you know, every time he wants to. This is a major nuclear power, one of the first nuclear powers. So it's kind of a shocking, you know, step to be taken. And it also then raises questions getting back to India and Pakistan that I mentioned before. You know, what if India and Pakistan decide to have a nuclear confrontation? We've always been worried about that. Or India and China, higher, you know, kind of unlikelihood, I would think there. But you're also hearing the Saudis wanting to have nuclear weapons, the Turks talking about nuclear weapons, the Japanese and the Koreans are super nervous about, you know, all of this right now. So the more that Putin is meeting with Kim Jong-un, the more he's behaving in some respects like Kim Jong-un, the more nervous you're making, you know, the rest of the neighborhood. Japan and South Korea are really stepping up in their support for Ukraine because they see all these ramifications from Russia's positioning in the Asia Pacific region as well. They worry about Russia getting closer to China. And, you know, as you know, mentioning before, the idea of Putin meeting with Xi, trips to Beijing, you know, it was a question whether Xi would, you know, go to Moscow. The BRICS summit was, you know, very much closely scrutinized for, you know, how Russia and China were interacting with each other. Putin didn't go to the G20. Xi didn't go to the G20. They're jettisoning some of the other institutional arrangements, but also the rest of the world is seeing Russia becoming increasingly dependent on China now. Another thing that was very interesting in some of the dialogues we've had with these counterparts was a comment that we got from our Brazilian colleagues. They said that they don't see the war in Ukraine as a proxy war between the United States and Russia, as many other countries do, like South Africa, for example. They see it as a proxy war between the United States and China. And we kind of a bit of a head explode there. That doesn't make sense, we thought. But then they explained further, it's because we're always talking about how China's watching what happens in Ukraine. And that because of the war in Crimea, that this has accelerated everybody's thinking about what China might do with Taiwan. I mean, we've all started talking about that and making the linkages, and the Brazilians hearing us make the linkages have decided that then maybe the war in Ukraine is a dry run for what might happen with a war between the United States and China. And they don't want to see a war between the United States and China. They want to see Russia continue as well as a balancing force. They really want to, kind of play, nice with China. They want to have China as a major trading partner. And, again, it was more about how they feel about us. I mean, one of our Brazilian interlocutors started off their conversation by saying, we are condemned to be in the same hemisphere as the United States. Oh, ouch. This doesn't sound, kind of like this is going to go very well. And we pushed back and we said, well, what would happen if there was a conflict between the United States and China? I mean, we're still, one of your biggest trading partners. We've got all of these long, standing relations. And well, we guess you don't like us, but how would you feel about that? I said, well, with reluctance, we would probably support the United States. So you can see how all of this is sort of playing out in all kinds of different ways. People don't necessarily see Russia as being a dominant player anymore, but as you're suggesting with the question, looking at Russia's interactions with other countries, North Korea gives a sign of weakness or that Russia's gone rogue and worries countries for different reasons. And then there's also this idea that Russia's becoming more and more dependent on China, but that China is the big issue. And all of this is really about the United States and China for some countries down the line. So it gets more complex by the moment. And it's why, I said before that this is a global system changing war, because it's changing the way that everybody, or it's revealing the way that people have changed their minds about world affairs.
Jeremy, next question, over to you.
Thank you. David asks about the inflection point of Russian decline. In thinking about the possible trajectory of declining Russia and China resurgent, is there a future scenario with Russia declining further, maybe losing the initiative in Central Asia or the Pacific?
Yeah, I think as David is suggesting, that's pretty much already happening. Although I think we've got a lot of questions, and certainly a lot of my colleagues who study China have got a lot of questions about what China's trajectory is as well. We're hearing a lot about the slowdown in the economy. Obviously, the demography of China has changed dramatically with the one-child policy. China worrying like the rest of us now about an aging population and, less of a workforce. We're hearing more about youth unemployment in China and dissatisfaction, building up there. Disruptions in China because of COVID and the pandemic supply issues, shifts in its ability to export. The war in Ukraine has really damaged China's relationships with Europe as well. I mean, I've heard that frequently when I was in Germany. There's been a rethinking about China because of China's seeming support for Russia in the war. The talk about a limitless partnership, and also the way that China is squeezing out a lot of European manufacturers. 10, 12 years ago, I was in China and, the Germans were riding high. They put all of their export potential in China. But I remember hearing at the time, Chinese business people saying, well, we won't need, kind of Germany in, 10 years from now because we'll be making everything here in China. You've already, been reading about how Chinese electric cars are starting, they've got a real head start on Germany. And they're starting to crowd the market. I saw a lot of really quite impressive looking Chinese made electric vehicles when I was in Europe as well, in various showrooms, brands I'd never heard of, but they look pretty amazing. I don't know how they drove, but it was really a kind of a wake-up call, for the Germans and the Europeans. And the Germans and Europeans are starting to see that China's looking at them as an export market rather than the other way around. And then the whole way that China was stood by, as Russia was just totally clobbered and destroyed Ukraine, has just given them a lot of pause for thought. They may not want to be part of the clash between the US and China, but they don't also want to be, taken for a ride by China, even if they might want to ride around in a very nice Chinese car. They are worried about, some of the things that China is doing. So there's a real shift going on there that makes me wonder about whether a resurgent China, is quite what we'll be talking about, but certainly a weakened Russia demographically with so many people having left economically, with so many people having left because while it's women and children leaving Ukraine, because all the men are at the front, there's a lot of men have left Russia. And Russia's young male population was already declining. They had a youth bulge in the early 2000s, that's already passed. The number of 18-year-olds is way down for recruiting into the military, which is why they're extending the conscription age to 35 and keeping on going there and recruiting in prisons and trying to recruit Tajiks and Kazakhs and other people we hear a lot about this happening at the moment. Russia's going to have a demographic crisis. Russia's got a lot of its innovative capacity because people are somewhere else. It's not to say that they can't continue to do the things that they're doing. And, one Russian emigre said to me, look, after World War II, we had all this devastation, we had all these people died, we still put Sputnik in space. Well, recently we saw India successfully basically land on the moon and Russia crash on the moon. So I think we're seeing, some very unfortunate symbolism here. And I think that this war, not only has it revealed, some real problems for us in terms of our image and NATO and all these concerns I said, that we had for Europe, but it also could be a real turning point for a weakened and very different Russia. Russia is never, ever as strong as it appears or as weak as it appears, so never count them out. But it's definitely a different Russia on a different trajectory. Yes, seemingly more dependent on China, but if China is also fading somewhat, that's not great for the Russian economy. In the 2000s, and I think this is one of the reasons that Putin is so keen on Xi and so keen on the China relationship. Russia's growth was driven by growth in China because China was, basically taking in, everything from oil and gas and timber and scrap metal and, weapons, all kinds of things from Russia. That's not the same. We've seen trade with China go up. That's because trade with other places has gone down. And, Russia's trade with the Middle East has gone up as well because trade with other places has gone down. So Russia hasn't been isolated, but its economy is having to shift in a completely different direction. So I think it's a really good question, and I think we just need to watch this very closely.
Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Hill. My question is, as the Soviet Union collapsed in 1992, and as we are progressing now to the 21st century, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was no question to that the world was a unipolar world, but the social-political and economic events that are happening as the 21st century is progressing, like the 2009 financial crisis of the capitalist world order, the COVID-19 pandemic and its crisis, the Ukraine war, of course, like you said, the BRICS, and how the talks of de-dollarization, and also the demographic decline in overall of North America, of US, of Europe, European countries, and simultaneous the demographic growth of the countries of the global South, and the migration and the resulting effects that is likely to happen. The effects of those in the of the countries in the global North. So, do you believe that that we're currently living in a unipolar world? I know it is being challenged by countries like Russia and China and so on. And so that's my question: is there a power transition happening? I know the question is a bit difficult.
No, I get the question completely. Look, I don't think we've been in a unipolar world for quite some time, actually. I mean, it's really what I was trying to talk about tonight, is that we're in a period of, great global transition. And in fact, when we talk about world wars, we're really talking about these system changing wars, or wars that reveal that the system has changed. World War I, kind of basically marked the end of European supremacy, actually, and the colonial era just took a bit of time, to kind of work its way out. Britain as a major sea power was kind of really very much undermined by World War One, same for Germany, etc. World War II really did see the end of that kind of imperial phase and against the domination of European powers in any way, and the rise of the United States, but also the rise of the Soviet Union. I mean, if it hadn't been for World War II, we wouldn't have had this, kind of bipolar world between the United States and the Soviet Union. Would never have bet on Russia in the form of the Soviet Union being a world dominant superpower if it hadn't been for World War II, because World War II enabled the Soviet Union to extend its influence in ways that you could never have envisaged. I mean, we were kind of, I guess, lulled into a false sense of security, or a particularly distorted vision at the end of the Cold War by kind of basically thinking that everything would stay the same. I mentioned the Germans put their whole post-Cold War trajectory on the idea that we would have perpetual peace and prosperity in Europe. And the Germans say they outsourced the security of the United States, they outsourced all their export markets to China, they exported or outsourced all their trade policy to the European Union, and they outsourced all their energy to Russia. And oops, all of this has gone wrong. So, I mean, we in the United States are also having to, I think, come to terms with, and we haven't really done that, with the fact that the world has really shifted. We've got, look, this is the only country in the world where we're in climate change denial. I didn't hear anybody anywhere in Europe say that climate change isn't happening. They're just questioning about who's going to pay for it. So the big argument in Germany is, does the state pay or do individuals pay? You don't hear disputes about climate change in India or Pakistan or, Saudi Arabia. Everybody else is diversifying, and, we're getting, left behind in this because we can't get over ourselves, as Mark said earlier. And I don't want to be political about this, but it's just, wake up, as to what's happening, because the rest of the world has, and we're going to get left behind with that. The digital transformation and technological transformation, all the Germans are grappling with the fact that the German auto industry will no longer be what it was before. Every other country is realizing that things are changing. So the European landscape is changing. And as I said, these dialogues that we've been having with other countries, you can see that they don't want to have a China, Russia, or United States framed world either. They don't see the Russians as being a dominant power anymore. They don't like the framing that the United States has a new Cold War between Russia and the United States and China. They didn't like the old one. They don't want to have to change their positions and join blocks. They're not talking about being non-aligned, just unaligned. India wants to be a major player. Brazil wants to be a major player. Egypt wants to be a player. Turkey wants to be a player. Saudi Arabia wants to be a player. Qatar wants to be a player. Every country and every interaction that we've had is the multipolar world that Putin talks about is not the one that everybody else wants either, where it's kind of Russia, China, the United States, and maybe Brazil and India. Everybody wants to have a say in their own neighborhoods. The challenge is going to be, how does that configure itself? That's why I was saying at the end that we have to think about how we use the United Nations, because a lot of countries still see value in the United Nations, in the General Assembly, and in some of the mechanisms that are there. We're going to have to think about regional groupings. The BRICS is a signal of this, although it's anything but a regional grouping. It's a bit all over the place, actually, and actually may not become one of the main organizations because it's kind of pretty disparate. But you can see that everyone's searching for something different. And so that's the world that we're facing right now. One of our Indian interlocutors said we're in a transactional world where, kind of basically every country is going to be making kind of deals and, trade-offs. And, we're not going to wanting to go back to all of these old blocks. And, that is going to be something that the United States is going to have to adapt to. Now, in all of this, the diminishing of the United States power in terms of economic and military power is quite relative. I mean, kind of every country is weaker in a way than it was before. I've already talked about the Chinese, kind of downturn. China's not necessarily like to be the global dominant power, either. But really, the kind of whole question is about moral standing. The thing that, I worry about most is how the United States moral standing has really diminished in all of the time since 9/11. 9/11, very sadly, was a real turning point in that regard. And I think we've got to think long and hard about how we regain our moral standing, because the rest of the world, no matter, even if they complain about us, ultimately in a lot of these discussions, they're always asking us, what are we going to do? There's still a desire for US leadership in different forms and in different ways. There's still a kind of a, as the Europeans have done, is to sort of turning back to the US, and everybody's asking the question about what are we going to do? Where's the United States heading? What role are we going to play? So I think there's still room for an important role of the United States in leadership in helping to craft new institutions. But the real demand is for not a unipolar world. Leadership doesn't have to be in that kind of frame. You can have moral leadership, you can have vision, and you can have ideas that help to lead. And there is a lot of question about what role the United States is going to play there. Still a great desire for people to come here, to study here. The United States is still greatly admired for its military and its other institutions. There's just a lot of worry about where are we headed right now.
Thank you. Back to you, Jeremy. We'll take one last question from the online audience. We'll conclude with one last question here, but over to you, Jeremy.
Okay, thank you. Looking at several questions that you might have already answered and looking for something different. What could be the basis of an agreement between Russia and Ukraine, let's say in a year's time or 2 years' time, to end the slaughter? What could each side take away successfully and sell to their people? And what could the US and other powers take from it, Europeans particularly, take from it as an acceptable end to the war?
This is really very tricky, which is again why we need a lot more serious diplomacy, because we know what Russia wants, and it's frankly unacceptable. Putin has said, very clear, the war can stop tomorrow if you recognize that Crimea, Donbass, and now Kherson and Zaporizhia are part of Russia. Well, why should anybody be recognizing the territories of Ukraine that everyone's recognized, including Russia itself, as part of Ukraine, should be just handed over to Russia? So there's, the kind of the rub on all of this. And then, most of the European neighbors of Russia would ask, well, hang on a second, would that even stick? I mean, there's a lot of, you'll read about this in the press many times. My colleague Angela Stent and I have been the subject of lots of kind of conspiracy theories, because we mentioned at one point in a foreign affairs article that there had been an effort to resolve the conflict with some various negotiations between Ukrainians and Russians in Istanbul and various places in March and April, and that one of the starting points of the discussion had been, basically to put Crimea in a kind of international territorial administrative sort of status, look forward to a bit like the Saarland, that has in Germany, or, at various points in there when it was disputed with France, and then having a referendum down the line, and an agreement that that Ukraine rather wouldn't join NATO. Now, that was just a kind of an opening gambit for a series of negotiations. I've been involved in lots of negotiations, including with the Russians, and usually, people are just sort of feeling out starting points. And that has long passed, because this is just on the eve of the Ukrainians hearing about Bucha and all the atrocities there. And of course, since then, Russia has annexed more territory. It's not just a question of Crimea, which the Ukrainians were willing to discuss and might still be in the future, but it's also Donbass and what happens there. And it's also Russia's claims now to even more territory. And you might have noticed in the Russian media recently, some of the Russian hardliners are saying, well, all this is just a stepping stone to Eastern Europe. So you've got an awful lot of, getting back to that question about what Europeans would feel acceptable, a lot of nervousness, now in the rest of Europe, that, Russia's not going to stop. And again, the Finns and the Swedes, who were, perfectly comfortable in managing their own relationships with Russia up until now, basically wanting to join NATO because of, their concerns about where Russia was headed in all of this. So the idea that the starting point should be a negotiation about what territory Ukraine is going to give up is just a non-starter. So you basically have to get to a kind of a point where the Russians themselves and Putin was willing to come to some kind of, table and with, what might be then an armistice or a truce on, kind of no preconditions, be willing to give a halt to the war, to try to see where we can go from there. But on the premise that Ukraine is an independent sovereign country that should not be giving up territory. Now, it may be that something like that happens down the line, but that shouldn't be a starting point. And that's where, kind of a lot of the debates have got awry and the Ukrainians have got really infuriated about. Someone said, well, give up Florida. Well, in 1783, Florida wasn't in the United States. I'm not sure that, kind of people in Florida would be too thrilled to be swapped for Crimea, but there are a lot of Russians in Florida. I'm just saying here, so there's a lot of Russians in Florida. So maybe we could consider it, a lot of people from other places in Florida as well. But anyway, but you see the kind of point here. Alaska, we bought it from the Russians, and a lot of Russians are now saying, well, we're going to get Alaska back again. When you start going down the path of starting with what territory you're going to give up, there's really kind of no end to that. So we have to have, there's basically a talk about maybe having a ruling from the International Court of Justice, basically saying and reaffirming that Ukraine is an independent state with its territory fully recognized by everyone in the international community. It's sovereign, and that what Russia has done is a violation of all of that, and basically having it level set at that base. Now that Jeremy obviously doesn't lead us towards what looks like a road of success, which is again why you have to really then constrain Russia's ability to keep on basically conducting this war, which means I fear that we're going to have a lot more years with this, unless there is suddenly the demise of Vladimir Putin, getting back to the first question, which might open up, something of a bit of space, but might not either. Because, we see in other settings that, people feel they've got to keep these wars going because, again, Russia does not want to lose. So it's very complicated and very difficult to kind of think about where we might head, but we've got to work on the diplomacy as well as on the battlefields. We've got to constrain, more and more, Russia's ability to conduct this war. Heading off, it's probably going to be a bit difficult to head off the North Koreans and the Iranians at the pass, but we have been actually able to keep China from giving weapons to Russia. Again, some of the rogue states, it might be harder. We've got to work with all of our partners and allies, our supposed partners and allies in places like the Middle East and elsewhere, so that it becomes, less and less easy for Vladimir Putin to show up at places. He didn't show up at the BRICS conference because he was nervous that, maybe thanks to the International Criminal Court, that he might get arrested by the South Africans. I don't think the South Africans, of course, wanted to do that at all, but they did sort of suggest to him nicely that maybe he might like not to come. For example, he won't get arrested in Beijing, that's for sure, but let's, kind of see, how he handles that trip. It's going to take us some time, but we've really got to work on, basically shrinking the aperture for action for Russia. There is, one, great episode that actually involves Russia of really excellent international diplomacy on the part of the United States, in fact. But it's hard to figure out that we would get to that point. It's the Portsmouth Peace Conference that ended the Russo-Japanese War. Both the Russians and the Japanese at that point wanted the United States to step in because the United States was seen as neutral. Now, we wouldn't be at that point, but it's what got Teddy Roosevelt the Nobel Prize, and justifiably so, because he proved himself to be a really adept diplomat. There was this long conference in Portsmouth. The people of Portsmouth actually created a very conducive atmosphere. They came out to support the two sides in their negotiations. Ultimately, Russia gave up territory because it had been actually defeated in the Russo-Japanese War. And it did actually, set in motion a series of treaties that held until World War II, when Japan made the mistake of coming into World War II with Pearl Harbor. And then, of course, Stalin took a lot of that territory back again in 1945. But one might have argued, had the Japanese, not made that fatal mistake in World War II, that the Japanese, kind of then Soviet relationship, as the Japanese-Russian relationship might have held going back to that time. So we have to kind of look at something that wouldn't just be temporary, but something that could be longer term. And it's going to be very hard. It's going to take an awful lot of effort. But we, just because it's hard doesn't mean we haven't to try.
Thank you. So we'll take one last question here in the room. I'm going to go with the hand that's highest.
Thank you, Dr. Hill, for coming to speak with us. I really appreciate you. I found your talk very educational and I learned a lot. My question is Russia's world standing threatened the longer the Ukrainian war continues? And how does this continuation of the war affect Russia's global standing moving forward?
That's a great question. I mean, look, if we maintain our resolve, then yes, its global standing is threatened. You know, if we just keep talking about the whole time, like, oh God, you know, we've had enough of this war, you know, we need to get Ukraine to just give it up, then Russia's global standing will bounce right back, because Putin will have proven that might makes right, and that all you have to do is wear everyone out. It will be a pretty salutary lesson for the rest of the world, and Putin will have prevailed. And I mean, look, the Ukrainians are the people who are dying in droves on the battlefield here. It's their country that's being absolutely devastated. They've got it, right? And I was in a meeting with some pretty senior Ukrainians and Finns just a couple of weeks before the war, when it was pretty obvious that something was going to happen, that the Russians were going to invade. And the Finns said, you're going to have to fight to the Ukrainians, because ultimately you can't be sure that everybody will stand up for you. But if you don't fight, nobody will. Because, you know, the Finns had to fight on their own in 1939. And the reason, it's very interesting that Stalin decided to end the war there, was he got some misinformation, you know, maybe some bad intelligence, maybe it was even, you know, some intelligence operation from who knows where, that suggested that the Finns were going to be suddenly assisted by the United Kingdom and, you know, other countries. And maybe even the United States in the war. This is 1939 under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, when the Stalin decided to try to retake Finland. And he decided, you know, basically to sue for peace, even though the Soviet Union was clearly winning and had taken, you know, most of Karelia. And the Finns lucked out, but it was also because they were fighting. And, you know, again, there was the thought of that support. So if Putin thinks that all of the support is going to go away, diplomatic, military, financial, from Ukraine, then, you know, he's just going to kind of hold out. He thinks, you know, that's what's going to happen here in 2024. He thinks that's what's going to happen across Europe. He thinks he's already, in many respects, prevailed with China. He's got North Korea and Iran, but he's, you know, hoping to keep everybody else on his side. And, you know, if that's what happens, if we fulfill that prophecy that he has, then his international standing will rise again, because he will be the person who, you know, basically grounds us all down. That's what he hopes to do. So his international standing continues to get damaged, because it already is being damaged, when he looks like he's losing. So he has to lose in the international court of public opinion, not just in the international court of justice, or, you know, kind of in on the battlefield. You know, we have to basically get other countries pushing back. So the more that countries say, you, Vladimir Putin, and Russia have to end this war, you know, the more chance we have of this war ending sometime in the near future, rather than grinding on, you know, for a much longer period. You know, and as I said before, though, Russia has been diminished by the atrocities, the blunders, the failures, the clear evidence that this wasn't a special military operation. And although Putin still looks strong and people are very frightened of him, you can also see a lot of the neighbors rushing away to the exits. You know, they're trying to keep as much distance as possible. And a lot of countries really trying to be much more measured about their interactions with Russia. And if we can also make it less about us, the United States, and less about the West for other countries, then you will really make a change. That's a tall order, though, because Russian propaganda, you know, has been at it for a long time. And of course, we've got a lot of people, you know, both domestically and elsewhere, who are dissatisfied with the United States and the way it's conducted itself, don't want forever wars, you know, don't want to be involved in the war in Ukraine because, you know, we've had too much of Afghanistan and Iraq as well. You know, so we've got a tall order here. But again, I hope I've made it clear that we have to show resolve, you know, to kind of stand up there and, you know, see this through as well. But thank you very much for the question. Thank you.
Well, thank you all this evening for coming out again, Dr. Hill. I know it's been a long day for you. Thanks for hanging out with us. Thank you. So again, please watch your email. I assume you will read them, even if I don't, for our next event in October, which we spent some time on Russia. We'll turn the page and spend some time with China. And again, if you're having any problems getting your dues paid, we can help you with that. Again, please remember to turn in your name tags, as well as the late General Cleveland would always remind me that we had to make sure nobody walked off with their name tag in a very Putin-esque fashion. Thanks again for coming out this evening, Dr. Hill. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
I locked my knee. And I don't know whether you ever do that. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
To show you things that I have. My dad was a B-17 in World War II. Junior varsity. Right after the TA, they